You'll figure it out. 4 words, written in my own son's handwriting on a torn piece of lined notebook paper, folded right next to a crisp $250 bill. I stared at that paper on the sunlit sidewalk of Boston, and for a terrifying second, my mind refused to translate reality. When you are 70 years old, standing on the pavement outside the heritage brick home you bought, paid for, and lived in for 45 years while strangers carry your life out in cardboard boxes, your brain doesn't scream. It just goes blank. My name is Eleanor Vance, and this is the story of how my only son, Marcus, legally stole my entire life, handed me $250 on a Tuesday afternoon, and told me to figure it out. Let me take you back just 6 weeks before that sidewalk moment. My right knee had been giving out for years, bone grinding on bone until walking down to my sewing studio felt like walking across shattered glass. The doctor said replacement surgery was mandatory. I was scared naturally. Who isn't at 70? But I had Marcus, the child I raised alone after his father passed away. I trusted him the way only a mother can. When Marcus offered to handle all the paperwork, medical insurance forms, and administrative headaches while I was in the hospital, I signed my name wherever he pointed. Why wouldn't I? He was my son. I thought I was signing papers so he could pay my medical bills and manage utilities while I learned how to walk again. I was wrong. So terribly, blindly wrong. On that crisp autumn Tuesday, I returned home from the rehabilitation center, expecting my quiet bedroom, my mother's antique Singer sewing machine, and the familiar smell of lavender. Instead, a massive moving truck blocked my driveway. 2 men were carrying my cherry wood dining table down the front steps. One of them stopped, looked at me, and asked politely, "Ma'am, are you here to pick up anything small before we finish loading?" I stared at him, my cane trembling. "No," I whispered. "I think you're taking everything." The mover frowned. "Oh, I was told the owner already moved out." "I am the owner." Before he could answer, the front door swung open. Marcus stepped out, holding a manila folder. He didn't run to hug me. He didn't ask how my knee felt. He just looked at me with that stiff, uncomfortable posture people reserve for strangers they bump into awkwardly in a grocery store aisle. "Hi, Mom," he said, just like that. "Hi, Mom." In the very front yard, where I had taught him how to ride a bicycle, where we built a treehouse together, and where I planted white hydra grease every spring. My eyes drifted past him. My late husband's oak desk was already inside the truck. The rocking chair where I used to nurse Marcus through childhood fevers vanished behind the slamming metal door. I looked back at my son, my voice cracking. "Marcus, what is this?" He took a slow, deliberate breath, rubbing the back of his neck, a nervous tic from childhood. "We sold the house, Mom." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because human reality sometimes short-circuits. "You sold my house?" "Marcus, my name is on the deed. It's completely paid off." "You signed a power of attorney before your surgery," Marcus replied, his voice dropping flat behind bureaucracy. "The lawyer said everything was legal. It was the practical thing to do." Legal. How effortlessly people hide behind that word when they are doing something monstrous. At that moment, out stepped my daughter-in-law, Jessica, wearing designer sunglasses and spotless white sneakers. She looked right past me, as if I were lawn furniture. "We have to leave if we're going to make it past Washington before dark," Jessica announced, checking her watch. She thrust a thick manila envelope into my chest and sighed theatrically. "Here, something to help you get started." I opened the envelope. Inside was a single, crisp $250 bill and that piece of lined notebook paper. 4 words in Marcus's handwriting. "You'll figure it out." I read it 3 times, looking for a joke, an explanation, anything. There was nothing. You left me $250? I looked up. After 45 years? Jessica crossed her arms, her lips tightening into a smug smirk. We're giving you independence, Eleanor. We didn't think you'd want to spend the rest of your life rotting away in some dreary assisted living facility. I never asked for an assisted living facility. My voice rose, sharp and broken. I wanted my home. We figured you'd rather make your own choices, Marcus muttered, staring at the gravel. We're moving to Atlanta for Noah's schooling. We couldn't afford maintaining 2 separate households, and honestly, the housing market right now is just too good to pass up. He didn't care about my sacrifices. To Marcus and Jessica, I wasn't a mother anymore. I was an equity asset. Where am I supposed to sleep tonight, Marcus? I asked. Tell me. Where does a 70-year-old woman with a replaced knee sleep when her own child locks her out? Marcus hesitated. There are motels along the highway. $250 should cover a few nights until you figure something out. Mom, you're much tougher than you think, Jessica added, her voice dripping with toxic positivity. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor of 40 years, stepped slowly off her porch, her eyes red with tears. She walked past the moving truck, ignored Marcus and Jessica entirely, and pulled me into her arms. Then she looked my son dead in the eye and whispered, I pray to God your own children never learn this from you. Marcus flinched. Within 20 minutes, the moving trucks roared away. 45 years of memories vanished into exhaust fumes, leaving only dark tire tracks on the asphalt. Marcus handed me a faded canvas duffel bag. We packed your clothes, your prescription medications, and a few toiletries. I took the bag. It felt sickeningly light. Everything else, gone. I guess that's it, Mom, Marcus said, lingering as if waiting for me to scream or weep. Instead, I folded the bill back inside the envelope, zipped my purse, and looked him straight in the eyes without a single tear. Yes, Marcus, I guess it is. I turned my back on them, walked over to my old 2010 Ford pickup truck, a reliable machine that still started every morning without lying to me, and opened the driver's door. Mrs. Henderson begged me to stay with her, but something deep inside required absolute silence. I drove into the autumn dusk, parking my truck beneath the flickering amber light of a quiet truck stop outside Richmond. I leaned my seat back. That was my new bedroom. I unfolded the note one last time. You'll figure it out. In the dark silence of that truck cab, clutching a duffel bag and $250, I made a silent vow that would reshape every remaining year of my life. I would never ask my son for another dime, and someday they would understand exactly what they had thrown away. The engine of my old Ford truck fell silent, and with it, the rest of the world seemed to stop. I sat there in the driver's seat of that cramped truck cab, parked beneath the buzzing amber glow of a highway truck stop outside Richmond, Virginia. Outside, the distant hum of 18-wheelers rushing through the autumn night sounded like waves crashing against a shore I no longer belonged to. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee, cold leather, and the lingering scent of lavender from the single canvas duffel bag sitting on the passenger seat. That night was the longest of my life. When your own flesh and blood betrays you, the pain isn't just emotional. It feels physical, like a heavy weight sitting squarely on your chest. I replayed every second of that sidewalk scene in Boston, Marcus's flat delivery, Jessica's cold smirk, and that $250 bill folded next to 4 mocking words. You'll figure it out. At 70 years old, after 45 years of building a home, raising a son alone, and pouring my soul into creating beauty, I was homeless. My joints ached, my newly replaced right knee throbbed with a dull fire, and my bank accounts were completely locked down. Every instinct told me to break down and let despair swallow me whole. And then, in the quiet darkness of that truck cab, I heard my mother's voice as clearly as if she were sitting right beside me, watching her mend torn coats for our neighbors when I was a little girl. Eleanor, a steady needle and strong thread can mend any torn fabric, but it takes an unbroken spirit to mend a broken soul. When the first pale streak of dawn broke across the highway, I turned the ignition. The old engine coughed twice and roared to life. I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of Richmond until I saw the weathered brick steeple of St. Jude's Parish, a modest neighborhood church with a welcoming wooden sign out front. I parked by the side entrance and walked inside with my cane. That was where I met Pastor Thomas, a kind, soft-spoken man with silver hair and warm eyes. I didn't ask for charity. Dignity is the one thing I refused to let Marcus strip away. I told him the truth, that I was an elderly artisan, displaced by family betrayal, looking for a temporary space to work and breathe. Pastor Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression filled with deep empathy. When I finished, he didn't offer pity. Instead, he smiled gently and handed me a heavy iron key. "We have an abandoned storage loft above the community hall," Pastor Thomas said. "It's dusty, and the stairs are steep, but it has good northern light through the skylight. Use it for as long as you need, Mrs. Vance." That loft became my sanctuary, my fortress, and the birthplace of my second life. Tailoring and garment restoration demand patience, precision, steady hands, and a lifetime of accumulated wisdom. In that loft, surrounded by timber beams and dust motes dancing in the morning sun, I set up my most precious surviving possession, my mother's heavy cast-iron Singer sewing machine. A few days later, Pastor Thomas climbed the steep wooden stairs, carefully carrying a steaming paper cup. He set it down gently on the edge of my work table. "Thought you could use some real coffee, Eleanor," he said with a warm, reassuring smile. I reached automatically into my pocket, my fingers brushing against my sparse remaining cash. "How much do I owe you for this, Pastor?" Pastor Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. "You're already paying for it, Mrs. Vance. You're fixing things around here." With just a pair of sharp fabric shears, a box of imported silk threads, and a handful of basic tools, I opened for business. At first, it was small. Local dry cleaners began sending me jobs they were too afraid to touch, antique lace wedding gowns stained by decades of attic dust, silk velvet evening coats with irreparable tears, and delicate heirloom christening robes. Other tailors looked at a shredded, water-damaged garment and saw garbage. When I looked at it, I saw a history waiting to be rescued. I remember an elderly woman named Clara who brought me her grandmother's 1920s flapper dress. The silk had rotted under the arms and the beadwork was falling apart. She was crying, clutching the fragile fabric to her chest as if letting go of the dress meant letting go of her grandmother entirely. I took the dress gently from her hands, running my fingers over the faded fabric. "Don't worry, Clara," I whispered. "We can save her." It took me 4 days of painstaking hand-stitching to restore it. When Clara came back to pick it up, she burst into tears of pure joy, tracing the restored seams in absolute disbelief. That day, as I watched her walk out holding her family history restored to its original glory, I discovered a profound truth that would define my workshop from that moment onward. Restoring a garment is never about hiding the scars of time. It is about honoring every single chapter of the story it has lived through. My own life was no different. The scars left by Marcus and Jessica, the betrayal, the cold paperwork, the cruelty of being thrown away, were real, but they weren't the end of my story. They were simply the torn seams of a garment waiting to be transformed into something far stronger, far more beautiful, and entirely unbreakable. Sitting at my sewing machine as the afternoon sun poured through the skylight, I threaded my needle, tied a secure knot, and took my first stitch toward the future. Word of mouth in Richmond moves quietly, but when true craftsmanship meets genuine need, it travels like wildfire. Within 6 months, my little loft above St. Jude's Parish transformed from a dusty storage space into a bustling sanctuary of restoration. Local boutiques began knocking on my door. Museum curators from downtown Richmond started sending delicate 19th century garments that other restoration houses wouldn't touch. I wasn't just fixing torn seams anymore. I was breathing life back into forgotten history, restoring velvet gowns, embroidered corsets, and century-old lace that whispered tales of another era. To keep up with the workload, I needed help. But I didn't hire professional tailors from high-end corporate houses with stiff attitudes and inflated egos. I looked for people whom the world had written off, just as it had written off a 70-year-old woman thrown out on the street by her only son. That was how Hank came into my life, followed shortly by a handful of young apprentices sent my way by Pastor Thomas, kids from broken foster homes and troubled backgrounds who possessed raw talent, but zero direction in a harsh world. Hank was a retired master carpenter in his late 60s with gnarled hands, a weathered face, and a quiet, steady presence that commanded respect without ever raising his voice. When he first walked into the loft carrying a heavy toolbox to fix a broken stair railing that wobbled every time I stepped on it, he looked around at my sewing tables, shook his head, and gruffly offered to stay on as our workshop handyman and general manager. "Place is falling apart, Eleanor," Hank muttered, wiping his brow with a plaid handkerchief. "Someone's got to keep these old timber beams from collapsing on your head while you're busy saving the world's wardrobe." Of course, building something from nothing was never a straight line to easy success. During our first bitter winter, a major museum restoration contract we were banking on fell through at the very last second due to unexpected administrative budget cuts. It left us scrambling so hard we barely made rent for December. I sat at my machine late into the night, staring at the ledger with a sinking chest, wondering if trying to build an empire at 70 was just a fool's errand after all. Hank noticed the fatigue and worry carved deep into my face, walked over in silence, and set a steaming cup of hot black coffee right beside my machine, staying there to help me organize the remaining orders until the work was finished. One sunny afternoon, after we had weathered that storm, I found him kneeling by the heavy workshop entrance, carefully planing down a swollen oak door that refused to latch shut properly in the summer humidity. I walked over, leaning against the wooden frame with my cane and watching him work with a soft smile. "You always seem to be fixing wood, Hank," I said gently. Hank paused, resting his plane on the floor, and looked up from his tools with a slow, crinkly smile at the corners of his eyes. "And you spend all your time fixing people, Eleanor. Someone's got to keep the balance around here." One evening, right as the sun was casting long amber shadows across the floor, I watched Maya, our very first apprentice, a quiet 19-year-old girl who had arrived at our doors with nothing more than a plastic trash bag of clothes, complete her very first independent commission. It was a delicate 1940s silk blouse with an intricate lace collar. When she successfully tied off the final, invisible hem stitch, she held it up against the evening light, her hands trembling with absolute pride. I walked over and handed her the envelope containing her first hard-earned paycheck. She stared at it, tears welling in her eyes, before looking up at me with a smile that could light up a dark room. As she walked out the heavy iron doors, clutching that envelope, wearing her head high, for the very first time in her life, I knew we were doing something far more important than saving old clothes. We were giving people their dignity back. With Hank managing the physical structure of the workshop and me guiding the needle, Vance Atelier slowly grew from a solitary loft into a thriving ecosystem of second chances. Every stitch became a quiet, stubborn victory against the bitterness of the past. The pain of what Marcus and Jessica had done wasn't erased, but it was transformed into a deep, unshakable foundation of resilience. We weren't just restoring vintage fabrics. We were rebuilding shattered lives, teaching these kids that flaws could be mended into strengths. By the end of our second year, high-end collectors and curators were flying in from New York and Chicago just to commission custom restorations. We were featured in regional arts magazines, and the revenue began piling up. But the true value of what we built wasn't measured by bank statements or corporate titles. It was measured by the dignity, laughter, and unbreakable bond of the people working side by side under that old timber roof. 4 years. That is how long it took for the past to finally claw its way back through the front door of my son's comfortable home in North Carolina. During those 4 years, I never once looked back with bitterness. I built Vance Atelier, mentored young apprentices, and let go of the ghost of Marcus. But time has a funny way of unearthing secrets that people try to bury in concrete. It started on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in Raleigh. My grandson Leo, whom I hadn't seen since he was a 17-year-old kid standing in my old Boston driveway on the day I was thrown out, was now 21 years old and a senior majoring in history. As part of a major semester research project on historic preservation, his professor assigned a documentary series spotlighting master artisans across the East Coast. Leo sat down in front of his laptop, plugged in his headphones, and clicked on a newly released national broadcast featuring Vance Atelier. The screen filled with high-definition shots of our Richmond workshop, the massive Northern Light panels, Hank framing antique textiles, and finally, me. At 74 years old, with silver hair pinned back and steady hands guiding a needle through a velvet hem, I spoke about the philosophy of garment restoration. Leo froze. He stared at the screen, listening to the name, Eleanor Vance. He didn't just recognize my face. He realized the terrifying, deliberate lie he had been fed for 4 years. When Marcus and Jessica moved south, they told Leo that I had chosen an upscale assisted living facility out of state, that I was fragile, and that I preferred complete privacy. They had erased me from every holiday conversation. That evening, the quiet suburban house in North Carolina erupted. Leo stormed straight into the home office where Marcus and Jessica were reviewing financial spreadsheets. Without a word, he slammed his laptop down onto the mahogany desk, spinning the screen around so the documentary was paused directly on my face. "Who is this?" Leo's voice shook with a cold, piercing fury neither of them had ever heard from him before. Marcus blinked, adjusting his reading glasses as the color drained from his face. Jessica dropped her pen, staring at the screen in sudden shock. "Leo, where did you find this?" Marcus stammered. "On my university syllabus," Leo shouted, his voice cracking with betrayal. "For 4 years, you told me Grandma Eleanor was in a retirement home because she couldn't take care of herself. But my grandmother is a nationally recognized master artisan running an empire in Virginia, while you two sat here and lied to my face every single day." "Leo, listen to your mother," Jessica cried out, rushing forward. "We only did what was necessary to protect you." "Protected me?" Leo cut her off with a bitter laugh. "You protected your wallets. You stole her home, threw her out with $250, and lied to your own son just so you could sleep at night." Marcus didn't try to defend himself. He slumped heavily into his executive chair, burying his face in his hands as choking sobs escaped him. Watching his own mother speak with absolute dignity on national television, the crushing weight of his sins finally crashed down upon him. Over the next 3 days, my phone started ringing incessantly. Unknown numbers flashed on my office screen over and over. Sometimes I listened to the voicemail previews, Marcus's voice, broken and desperate, choking through tears, pleading for forgiveness. I never answered a single call. Some might call that cruel, but I knew better. I didn't ignore Marcus out of petty malice. I ignored him because I had learned a fundamental truth. Apologies driven by sudden exposure and public humiliation are not repentance. They are simply panic. My peace was too hard won to trade for cheap, late-night tears. While Marcus was drowning in his own regret at home, Leo couldn't stay another minute under that roof of lies. That very night, he packed a duffel bag, threw it into his car, and drove straight through the dark, empty interstate for hours. As the miles rolled by, he kept the documentary audio playing on his phone, listening to my voice over and over, remembering the summers we spent baking cookies. 3 days after the documentary aired, right around closing time, the bell above the entrance of Vance Atelier chimed softly. I looked up from my cutting table. Standing in the doorway was my grandson, exhausted, his eyes red from driving all night, carrying his duffel bag over his shoulder. He didn't ask for a handout. He walked slowly toward my desk, set his duffel bag down on the concrete floor, and looked me straight in the eyes. "Grandma," Leo said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I packed my bags. I left home. I don't want anything to do with my parents' money or their world. If you'll have me, I want to learn your trade. I want to start at the very bottom, sweep the floors, and work beside you as your lowest apprentice." I stared at my grandson, feeling a warm surge of pride wash over my chest. The children of my blood had tried to destroy me with greed, but through my grandson, innocence had found its way back home. I walked around the desk, opened my arms, and pulled him into a tight, unbreakable embrace. The next morning, the heavy iron doors of Vance Atelier didn't open for a wealthy tourist or a museum curator. They opened for my grandson, Leo. He didn't get special treatment just because we shared blood. When Leo walked in wearing a simple cotton t-shirt and jeans, carrying his canvas duffel bag, I didn't greet him as a doting grandmother. I handed him a large push broom and pointed squarely at the sawdust-covered concrete floor near the cutting tables. "If you want to learn here, Leo, you start right where everyone else starts," I told him firmly. "No shortcuts. Respect the craft from the ground up, and the craft will respect you back." For the first few weeks, Leo didn't touch a single piece of antique lace. His hands blistered from sweeping floors, hauling heavy bolts of raw denim, and sorting fabric scraps. Hank kept a close eye on him, making sure he pulled his weight without a single complaint. He never complained once, even when his muscles ached at the end of the day. And mistakes happened, of course. During his second month, Leo rushed through a seam on a heavy canvas utility apron, bunching the tension so badly the thread knotted into a rigid, puckered disaster. He stared at it in frustration, biting his lip. I walked over, picked up the seam ripper, and gently tapped his hand. "Don't look so defeated, boy," I chuckled, smiling softly as I handed him the tool to pick out every single rogue stitch. I ruined hundreds of yards of fabric before I ever made one piece worth keeping. Mastery isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about having the patience to undo them and try again. Leo grinned, shaking his head as he went back to work. As the months rolled by, He graduated from sweeping floors to organizing spools and cutting basic patterns under supervision. Those quiet afternoons working side by side in the sunlit loft became our sanctuary. As my needle moved steadily, Leo slowly began to open up, shedding the heavy emotional armor he had worn under his parents' suffocating roof. "Grandma," Leo whispered one rainy afternoon, practicing an invisible slip stitch. Back home, the silence in that house felt louder than any argument. Mom and Dad, they only cared about stock portfolios, country club memberships, and how many followers their company's brand had online. If you weren't climbing some corporate ladder or making obscene money, you didn't exist to them. I couldn't live that lie anymore. I stopped my sewing machine, looked over at him, and saw the deep shadow of loneliness in his eyes, the exact same shadow Marcus used to carry before greed hollowed him out. I laid my hand over his young, calloused fingers. "Money is a terrible master, Leo," I told him softly. "You aren't responsible for the toxic choices your parents made. You only have to decide what kind of person you want to become when the silk of your life gets torn and the stitches unravel." Working together bridged years of silence until a gray Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. The bell above the atelier entrance chimed loudly. I didn't look up immediately, assuming it was a courier, but the heavy, suffocating silence that suddenly filled the workshop made every single apprentice stop working instantly. I raised my eyes slowly from the cutting table. Standing near the front entrance, bathed in the harsh autumn light, were Marcus and Jessica. The transformation in them was jarring. The sharp, arrogant posture they wore when they threw me out was entirely gone. Marcus looked 10 years older, his expensive tailored suit hanging loosely off his thin, shrunken shoulders. Jessica stood beside him, clutching a leather briefcase against her chest like a fragile shield, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Leo dropped his fabric shears onto the cutting table with a sharp, echoing clatter. He stepped immediately in front of me, putting his young body squarely between his parents and my workstation, his jaw clenched in tight fury. "What are you doing here?" Leo demanded, his voice ringing out across the quiet atelier. Marcus didn't look at his son. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a desperate weight of exhaustion and defeat. Slowly, with trembling fingers, Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He walked forward, stopping just a few feet away from my desk, and laid a certified bank cashier's check right on top of my cutting table, alongside a stack of formal financial ledgers. I glanced down at the paper. The figures printed on that check were staggering. It represented the exact market value of my old Boston home, multiplied by inflation, plus every single cent of accumulated interest accrued over 4 years of illegal displacement. The air in the workshop grew thick and tense. The ultimate confrontation had finally arrived. The silence inside Vance's atelier was heavy enough to break bone. Marcus stood there in the middle of the room, breathing hard, his hands still shaking as they hovered over the certified cashier's check, resting right on top of my cutting table. For a long, suffocating moment, nobody moved. Then his knees buckled under the unbearable pressure. The proud corporate manager, the man who had stood on a cold Boston sidewalk 4 years ago with zero remorse, dropped straight down onto the hard concrete floor. He knelt there, right between the heavy work tables, his head bowed low, tears spilling fast down his hollow cheeks. Mom, please," Marcus choked out, his voice cracking into a ragged sob. "You have to understand. We were terrified. The markets were crashing. The corporate pressure was suffocating us, and we were drowning in debt. We were cowards, Mom. Please just look at this check. It covers everything, every single penny of the house, plus 4 years of full interest. Let us fix this. Let us bring you home." Jessica dropped to her knees right beside him, sobbing hysterically as she grabbed the edge of my work table like a drowning sailor. "Please, Eleanor, please find it in your heart to forgive us," Jessica wailed, her mascara running down her pale face in ugly black streaks. "We want our family back under one roof." All around the workshop, my young apprentices watched in absolute disbelief. Leo stood right beside me, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching in his cheek, his hands balled up into white-knuckled fists. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. Slowly, Jessica reached forward, pushing the thick manila envelope and the certified check slightly closer to my hands. Without saying a single word, I reached out with 2 fingers, placed them squarely against the edge of the check, and deliberately slid it backward, pushing it right back across the wood toward them. Then, I picked up my heavy steel fabric shears, laid them across the cutting table with a crisp, final clack, and looked down at my son. When I spoke, my voice wasn't filled with blind rage. It was cold, crystal clear, and as sharp as a razor blade. "Marcus," I said, stepping closer to the edge of the desk so he had to look up into my eyes. "Look at me." Marcus raised his ruined face, his lips trembling violently as he tried to gasp for air. "Are you handing me this check to genuinely make amends for what you did?" I continued. "Or are you just trying to purchase a cheap, easy conscience so you can sleep comfortably at night without feeling like a monster?" Marcus opened his mouth, but not a single sound came out. 10 seconds passed in absolute, pin-drop silence. Marcus tried to force words past his lips, but his throat seized up completely. Beside him, Leo stared down at his father with a look of profound, chilling detachment. Not a soul broke the silence. 4 years ago, I said calmly, breaking the quiet, you and your wife dragged an elderly mother out onto a freezing Boston sidewalk. You handed me $250, the price of a cheap bus ticket, and told me to figure it out because I was dead weight in your pristine suburban life. You chose status and cold cash over your own flesh and blood. Jessica let out a sharp, choked gasp, shrinking backward. "And now," I whispered, leaning forward slightly, 4 years later, you see that I didn't die in a ditch. You see that I built an empire. You see national television crews and wealthy collectors walking through these doors, and suddenly your mother isn't an inconvenient burden anymore. She is a public relations asset you desperately want to claim back to save your social standing." Marcus opened his mouth again to stammer out a defense, but the words dissolved into nothing. He sat there kneeling on the hard concrete, completely unmasked, exposed, and utterly ruined by his own unvarnished truth. The absolute crushing weight of his own greed had finally buried him alive. I stood tall, my hands resting calmly on my cutting table, knowing that the battle was already won, and my soul was entirely free. I looked down at the certified cashier's check resting on my cutting table, then back up at my son, who was still kneeling on the concrete floor like a broken man. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. "Take it back, Marcus," I said, my voice steady, quiet, and completely devoid of any lingering anger. Marcus blinked, his red, tear-streaked eyes widening in utter disbelief. He stared up at me as if he hadn't quite heard my words right. "Take your money, take your ledgers, and walk back out those doors," I continued, speaking slowly so every single person in the room could hear. "I don't want your millions. I don't want the market value of a house you stole from me 4 years ago. You want to ease your conscience? Don't try to buy your absolution from me. Take that money, give every last cent of it to charity, or use it to pay off the real debts you owe to the world. My life, My workshop and my peace are not for sale. They never were. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His hands hovered over the check for a long moment, trembling violently, before he slowly pulled them back. He finally realized with a crushing finality that some things in this life can never be bought back with a checkbook. Jessica stood there frozen beside him, her face completely pale, staring at the ground in absolute defeat. Without another word, Marcus slowly picked up the envelope, rose unsteadily to his feet, and looked at his son standing beside my desk. "Leo," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate, heartbreaking plea. "Please, come home with us." Leo didn't flinch. He kept his shoulders squared, looking straight into his father's eyes with a quiet, unwavering maturity. "No, Dad," Leo answered softly, his voice clear and firm. "My home isn't in a suburban house where human worth is measured by bank accounts. I'm staying right here. I'm going to learn this trade from the ground up, build my own future with my own hands, and earn every single thing through honest work. You and Mom need to figure out your own lives. I'm done living in that illusion." Marcus closed his eyes, a single tear escaping down his worn cheek. Without making another sound, he turned around, took Jessica by the arm, and walked slowly toward the heavy iron doors. The door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing away the past for good. Time has a remarkable way of healing wounds when you stop picking at them with regret. 3 years passed in the blink of an eye, bringing us to my 84th birthday inside the walls of Vance Atelier. The morning started with a wonderful, chaotic flurry of real family warmth. The young apprentices had spent the entire previous evening secretly turning the break room into a makeshift bakery. Leo proudly carried out a slightly lopsided strawberry cake he had baked himself from scratch, covered in an ambitious, uneven layer of white frosting that had melted slightly around the edges. Hank stood leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, watching us with a stern, deadpan expression on his weathered face. "Don't look at me, Eleanor," Hank grunted, shaking his head with a faint twinkle in his gray eyes. "I told these kids baking a cake was outside our standard workshop operation procedures. I didn't help with a single egg." With a mock serious sigh, Hank reached into the pocket of his carpenter's vest and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped wooden box, sliding it across the table toward me. "Though I suppose I can make an exception for an old boss. Found some scrap mahogany in the back and carved you a proper thread spool holder. Stop losing your needles in the sawdust." I burst out laughing, the sound echoing warmly through the bustling loft, surrounded by people who loved each other not for what we owned, but for who we were. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the antique wooden floors, I walked over to the small corner office near the back of the workshop. Hanging neatly on the wall, framed in simple dark wood behind clear glass, was a weathered piece of paper and a worn, creased bill. It was the old, crumpled $250 bill alongside the mocking, handwritten note Marcus had thrown at me on that freezing Boston sidewalk 4 years ago. "You'll figure it out." Every single morning, when I walked into the atelier, I looked at that frame, not with bitterness, but as a quiet reminder of how far grace can carry you. I stood there by the window, watching Leo laugh with the other apprentices as they packed up for the evening, and a profound peace settled deep into my bones. The real danger isn't losing your house, it's losing the courage to build another one. I smiled, turned away from the glass, and walked back into the bright, bustling room to celebrate another year of living fully, truly, and completely free. Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below, so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.